Hello and welcome to Writing with Sofie, Top 3 Takeaways, where education and business influencers discuss teaching writing and communications online, in a classroom, and at home. In the studio with me today is Sofie, the video star of the Writing with Sofie ebook series. And on the line today, I am so completely honored to have Dr. Paula Hayes, who is a PhD in English and Textual Studies. Prior to entering the field of English, she studied philosophy and comparative world religions and holds an MA in philosophy. Her specializations in English include poetics and modernism, composition and rhetoric, and working with academically at-risk students. She is a published author in the area of literary criticism and poetry. Her works include the book Robert Lowell and the Confessional Voice, which examined the rise of all the confessional movement within modernism and poetics. Her literary criticism and original poetry has been featured in a variety of journals, and she has a new work of original poetry, which is really exciting. Can't wait to buy it, The Bushel and the Light, that will be forthcoming in early 2021. She has worked in the field of higher education for over 20 years, teaching at the intersections of traditional universities, corporate universities, and community colleges. Having taught in 3 of the major sectors of higher education has given Dr. Hayes a unique window of seeing into the different types of challenges that students face when confronting their writing. She lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and is currently an instructor of English at the University of Memphis. So welcome, Paula.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I am, first of all, honored to be a guest on your podcast, and I've had the pleasure of working with you for well over a decade at this point. So it's always an honor to just be able to sit down and have a conversation with you about something that I know we both love, which is teaching.
Yes, and I'm thrilled to have you here because not only are you an incredible teacher, but you're a colleague who has always kept up with your scholarship and dedicated yourself to being a writer yourself. And we will get into that down the road. But because we've known each other in the field of teaching, and I've had firsthand experience to see how marvelous you are at it, you've told me that one of the things that you really love about teaching is helping students learn to write well. So could you talk a little bit about your experience, what you've learned from that, and what you love about it?
Absolutely. So one of the greatest privileges I've found as an educator is being able to really see students grow and develop in their writing skills. I think anyone who teaches in the field of English has probably at some point or another asked students the question, maybe somewhere around the first day of class, the first week of class. I know I've asked students this question before. When they come in, I tend to ask them, what do you enjoy about writing? Or in some cases, I'll actually phrase it differently, and I'll just ask them, do you even enjoy writing?
Right.
And I start with that question because it enables students to just open up and begin talking about the sense of what I call writing anxiety or writing angst that so many of them come into the classroom with. And once they're able to, feel comfortable expressing that, well, in some situations, in some contexts, I love to write if I'm not being judged or graded, or if I don't feel like someone's being critical of my writing, or if I'm able to just get my thoughts out on paper, then yes, I love writing. But if I feel confined to an assignment, or I feel like the professor or the teacher is going to judge every word that I'm saying, then I freeze up, I get writer's block, and no, then I don't enjoy it at all. And so that kind of dichotomy, which is so common among students, the love of writing or the anxiety of writing being rather contextual, that's something that I try to work with students on, because I think it's very important as an educator to listen and to listen actively to what your students are telling you, to not just assume. And so in that practice of engaging in active listening, what I've picked up on and what I've learned myself from my students about their writing is that they need an environment that will foster their natural enthusiasm toward expressing themselves. Because who doesn't love to express themselves?
Right, so true, so true.
But they need an environment where they can learn to do that in a way that will be shaped toward their career or their toward a business practice or toward the rest of their college curriculum, toward academia, whatever the case may be, but to shape it in a way that nurtures their natural voice, not, in some sense oppresses it, and where they don't feel like writing is this judgy, critical act. And so, just learning that from students, right? Learning how to encourage them to find their natural voice, for me personally, has been one of the biggest joys of teaching writing.
And I know that we've talked about that, and that's where we're simpatico in terms of that. And can you tell us some of the strategies, the ways that you pull that out, the way that you create that environment or get your students to feel safe enough to share with you that writing angst and begin the journey of overcoming it?
One of the ways that I have discovered, I would say within the last 10 years, and I try to put this into practice as much as I can, and I would recommend this as a sound pedagogy that has been proven to be effective. I use Dr. Carol Dweck's theory of growth mindset. And I know that mindset, in terms of a psychological motivational tool, is something that has been in the field of education for a while now, but it's worth always talking about. So one of the things that I do is I ask students to explore where some of their writing anxieties may have developed. And so we spend some time at the start of a semester. I try to do this usually the first week to 2 weeks into a semester or a quarter, regardless of what the curriculum is, if it's a writing composition course, where we spend some time with them talking out loud with small groups, sharing, but also writing down, journaling their experiences with writing prior to coming into that particular course. And so we explore positive experiences that they've had in terms of places where they have felt affirmed in their writing, something that they can build from. And then we also explore places where they may have been accidentally shut down in their writing. So if someone said something negative to them about their writing, just a comment, maybe it was a fourth grade teacher who said, "You're not doing this correctly." And then that put into their way of thinking that writing has to be correct. And they, that creates an anxiety. Or, maybe they received a low grade on a high school paper that they worked really hard on, and it just kind of destroyed their confidence. So we explore all of these things. We go deeper with it as well. We explore things such as dialect. If they are from a community that speaks a dialect that society has, in some sense, judged or not understood as it should have understood, we talk about that. We talk about how you can maintain parts of your dialect in your natural voice and incorporate that into your writing so that you don't feel like when you're going into an academic vocabulary that you're sacrificing a part of your identity or part of yourself. So we explore all of these elements. We also talk a lot about just the difference between a fixed mindset and a growth mindset when it comes to challenges. The fact that inevitably all writers, it doesn't matter if it's a student writer, a professional writer, but all writers will at some point or another face challenges within their own writing. And how you take those challenges and you don't see it as an affront against your own ability or talent or intelligence, but instead you see it as just an opportunity to grow. And so we talk a lot about how to shape that and how to give feedback and how to receive feedback so that it doesn't feel like an affront, so that it actually does feel like this opportunity to continue to develop. But it really takes a couple of weeks at the beginning of any course to lay that as a foundation. And what I've found is that the semesters that maybe I didn't do that for whatever reason, I felt like, well, I need to go on with the curriculum as it is, or whatever the issue may have been. In the semesters where I've omitted that, they just simply haven't been as successful. And then in the semesters where I make sure to include that foundation at the beginning, those have always inevitably been the most productive semesters. And then, of course, there are other things that we emphasize as well that are common to composition, such as knowing that writing is a recursive act, that it's not something you do one time, but it's something that you always revisit, that writing is never finished, it's never complete, and that doesn't have to sound like drudgery or a chore.
Right.
That can
just
be
part
exciting,
of the process.
Absolutely, yes. So the process component, the revision component, all of that are strategies we use as well, and then writing workshops, which we can talk about more if you would like. But certainly having that foundation, I think, is just tantamount to their becoming comfortable with writing.
Right, and that's a way to go back to the beginning when you said the writer's angst, that to really tease that out and look at it and say, all writers are anxious. It's hard work, and it's work that has to be redone. I mean, you can always use the sports analogy of learning to shoot a 3-point shot. You have to do it over and over and over. You were talking about writer anxiety and making sure that you discuss the fixed and growth mindset in the beginning of the class. I wonder how much of this is also self-confidence, because it seems to me that so many writers just think it's growth mindset, certainly, but how do you instill in them, what are some of the techniques that you use to get their confidence up going for their writing? You started to mention writers' workshops. Do you use those as a way to promote self-confidence within a group?
Yeah, I love that question. I really do. I'll be honest, I haven't heard that question in a long time, or maybe at all, because so often the questions are about a pedagogy, is it effective or is it not? But that human element of just writers tend to, or at least individuals we think of as writers, we picture in our minds as writers, they do tend to seem to exude a degree of confidence within their writing. And so I think that human element about where is a person's confidence level with regard to their own writing is a fascinating and wonderful question. And so, yeah, there are lots of ways inside the classroom to build this. Growth mindset is one way, but there are other ways too. The cultural pop icon myth of what is a writer. I think there's this image that writers, and you see this in film a lot of times, that writers tend to be wrecked individuals, that they tend to be somehow maybe have all these other character flaws and deficits in other areas of life, but they can pull it together and rise to the occasion when it's time to produce a work, and somehow they mystically produce the work through divine inspiration that just strikes them like lightning. And the problem with that is that 90% of your students, or 100% of the students, are sitting there with that image in their mind, and they think, that's not me. And I think the reality is most educators think that's not me. But if we were to have honest conversations with writers, we would find out they too think that's not me. And so part of it is myth dispelling. We get into some really good conversations about that. What are the myths and social representations and cultural representations that you have of writers that you're holding in your mind, that you're trying to match and meet up to, and you think, I can't do that? Like, for example, if someone said, go take piano lessons to me, I mean, I would immediately think, I'm not going to become this great composer of symphonies. I'm not the next Beethoven. And so I might just ignore it or disregard it or not put 100% into it because I'm holding some image in my mind of what genius is. And I think students do that with writing. They feel like if they don't walk into the classroom with what they think of as natural talent or genius or divine inspiration with it, that they can't somehow be a writer. And all of this really is tied to their prior experiences and what they've been told and taught about writing. So, dispelling some of those myths is helpful. So once that myth is out of the way, then the next question becomes, well, then what actually is a writer and how do you become one? Even if it's just a college writer for the duration of your college courses, or even if it's a writer at times doing a business report or a SWOT analysis for your career or whatever it may be. And so what we discover by we actually look at some answers that writers have given, we find that writers are like anyone else. They need structure, they need routine, they have to have a time of day when they write. One of my favorite writers, the New York Times bestselling author Anne Lamott, has said that she makes herself sit down in the same place at the same time every day, if possible. If she's not traveling, she does that because it signals to her mind, to her subconscious part of her mind, that it's time to get down to the business of writing. And she also says that she keeps on her desk a little picture frame that it's very small, and it reminds her that in those hours, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 30 minutes, maybe it's 2 hours, she's going to sit down and write, that all she can really get accomplished in that length of time is some little small part of the bigger piece of writing. And so learning that structure, having writing habits, healthy writing habits, having a writing routine, not trying to produce the whole work at once, learning how to take it in steps. All of those are part of what it means to be a realistic writer as opposed to this imagined image of a writer. And I think what students realize, going back to your question on self-confidence, is that it increases their self-confidence when they realize this is something that's attainable, it's something realistic, it's a skill set, it's something you can learn in steps with a process, and it's not by any means something that only a handful of people can do. It's actually a life skill that we all need to know how to do. And so just, I think, realizing it can be a realistic, attainable goal helps increase that confidence.
I was just going to say that makes so much sense. And I was thinking about the mythology students often have of the audience, to whom they're writing. I mean, usually it's a teacher, correct? But you just mentioned that you want them to be able to write for their SWOT analysis, for their job, or whatever they're writing on. And how do you dispel some of the mythology that you're only writing for a teacher and you can begin to imagine an assignment or a writing for something that's really real in your life that you care about to voice?
I mean, that is 100% another component of this. Learning how to assess an audience, who you're writing for. One of the wonderful things about thinking about audience also, and this is something we haven't talked about yet, but I think is so important, is the idea of community. Understanding that once one takes on that task of being a writer, whatever that may be, often, and I think really the majority of the time, you're not writing for yourself anymore. Unless you are journaling or unless you're writing something that has personal meaning that you know isn't going to be seen by others, I think the majority of writing that a person does is really for others. And realizing that when you write for others, often that brings you into a community in a multitude of ways. It means that the writer, him or herself, begins to take on more of a communal voice, may have different responsibilities of who to represent, how to represent within one's writing, and then also that the fact that you are writing for a reader or an audience means that then that builds a connection and a bridge to others, and that too is a community. And so I've personally found that shift in terms of perception about what one is doing with writing, that move into understanding that you're not writing for a teacher or an instructor who's going to be critical and grade and judge, but instead you're learning how to write for an audience that you're actually in a community with.
So speaking of the community of writers, because you are such a brilliant scholar and a big reader of all things pedagogy, could you give us some book recommendations for those of us here who would like to learn more about teaching writing?
These are the 5 that stay in my personal canon and that I refer back to continuously. What's interesting about the 5 I'm going to recommend, they are not specifically about how to teach writing, and they don't have writing in the title, and if you read them, they don't mention writing all that much, but they inform every single thing that I do with writing. And so the list I would give in my top 5, the first 2 are actually occupied by the same author, Bell Hooks. Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope. I love that one. Her more, I think, canonical work, I would also list Teaching to Transgress.
It's a great book.
And I'll talk in a minute about why these are so important. Paula Hayes, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, foundational in education. James Lang, which is a more current work, but James Lang's Small Teaching, Everyday Lessons from the Science of Learning, which asks us to reevaluate how we incorporate critical thinking skills into the classroom. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier Carol Dweck, her work, Growth Mindset. And so those 5 have become my personal canon for teaching. The first 3, if I can, I'll briefly kind of indicate why these 5. The first 3, with the 2 by Hooks and the 1 by Freire, about pedagogy for the oppressed, I personally have found so helpful because, one, those works advocate for what I would call a decentered classroom. And what I mean by that is a classroom where the instructor, and in this case the writing instructor, is not the center of the show. And this is really important for any form of education, that the instructor lets go of, instead of going in with a lecture and you're lecturing for 50 minutes and students are passively just sitting there absorbing that and trying to memorize it and spit it back out. Study after study and research has shown that it's ineffective. And so a decentered classroom is obviously going to take a different approach where students are co-creators in their own learning process. Now, as important as that is for any subject, I think it's really critically important when you teach writing.
Agree.
Because if you just think about like a basic assignment that you give a student, it takes something like a research paper, something that's very traditional. Oftentimes, one of the great things about a research paper, if it's taught well, is that the student has control over how to shape that writing, from the creation of the topic to gathering the research, down to thinking about audience, down to producing the work. But it's all in the fact that the student is in charge of the writing. And so really, that's so important as a pedagogy, learning how to foster in other individuals the skill set and not try to jump in there and replace what they're doing or overcorrect it, but just you're guiding them through the process of writing. So it's been important. Yeah. I mean, it's been super important for understanding what a decentered classroom looks like. It's also been really important for me as an educator. I mean, I teach in the South. I teach specifically in Memphis, Tennessee. And anyone knows anything about Memphis, we have, as the South in general, we have a disproportionate amount of poverty in impoverished communities. And so students who may be coming into college, having experienced a set of circumstances by being in an impoverished community or even being in an oppressed, marginalized community, I think it's particularly important for those students to feel like writing for them is something that they can connect to be able to voice
True.
those experiences and to share them with others.
Yes.
I mean, it's all about empowerment within that. So for those reasons, those 3 books make the top 3 of my 5.
Good choices.
Thank you.
So what about the other 2? What would you say? Or I guess.
Oh, the other 2, yes. So James Lang, I came across this one a couple of years ago. For me, one of the things I loved about it is that it took the idea of critical thinking and it turned it on its head. It helps, I think, educators to learn how to construct lessons and lesson plans in their curriculum where each phase of their lesson plan is infused with some element of critical thinking. I think it was significant in terms of understanding that everything in the classroom has to be purposeful, and not just purposeful in the sense of leading toward an outcome of a large writing assignment, but that in addition, you're also trying to lead toward building higher levels of critical thinking and trying to infuse your writing assignments with that. And then Carol Dweck, of course, has been revolutionary in the sense of teaching the world about what growth mindset is, how to apply it, and how to help students move past fixed mindset as well.
So given these central pedagogies that have informed your thinking, the decentered classroom, the critical thinking, and the growth mindset, how have you been able to put those key elements of pedagogy into the online world, because so many of us are now facing how to make effective classrooms online? Can you give us a couple of techniques or strategies that you've used that have been successful?
Obviously right now with the changes that have so quickly overtaken education, pandemic that we're in, a lot of educators who have never had to teach online before suddenly are being asked to teach online. And so even, once we're out of this public health crisis, I think an outcome of this will be that education will move more in an online direction than it was in the past. And I've taught, as you have, we both have taught online for a number of years prior to this. And of my many hats that I wear, I still teach online. So one of the things that I would recommend is the concept of translation. What I mean by that, you have to let go of the idea that what you do on ground just translates into something online. It doesn't necessarily.
It doesn't,
And so you really have to learn a whole new set of strategies and approaches. So, for example, in an on-ground classroom, I could maybe, if I were talking about growth mindset, I might be able to have activities over the course of 3 different classes, an hour and 20 minutes for each of those classes. And that kind of breadth of time, just allows you to approach the material in a different way. But if I'm teaching it online, I have to realize that I have to segment what I'm talking about. So, for instance, I found that videos work very well, but you have to be careful. You can't do a 20, 30-minute lecture video.
Right, Sofie?
I should say hi to Sofie when we're in this. Hi, Sofie. Sofie would agree.
Yes, she'd agree.
30 minutes, yes.
Too much.
The attention span is somewhere else. And but small segments, 3 to 5 minutes, work well for videos. And that goes back to purposeful planning. So you distill the major concepts that you want the student to acquire at that given time, and you put that one concept into the video. I would kind of use this analogy. A basic thing that students learn when writing paragraphs is, one idea, one paragraph. If you've got 10 ideas in a paragraph, you probably have too many. So it's a bit like that with videos online. One key concept per video. And that may mean that you have more videos in there over the duration of the course. That's okay, because there is these small segments. But I think it helps. It helps with focusing
Does
attention.
help.
It helps with knowing what you're supposed to grasp. Yeah. So I found that to be really useful. The other thing, presence. Presence is huge. And what I mean by that one is that the professor has to be present in that online classroom, because it goes back to that idea of community. So present in the discussion, present in terms of being there to answer questions students may have, whether that's office hours. There's a lot of tools you can use to do virtual office hours, in person, well, not really in person, but it mimics in person, online, something like Zoom, where you can see one another interact. That's helpful. But I think the danger of online for students is that it would be so easy to feel anonymous in that class.
Right.
If you feel like you're just logging in and you're looking at the material and you're logging back out, that's what you don't want to happen. You want the student to feel like when they log in that they are seeing that professor, they are seeing in some sense the ideas of the other students, and that they're actually really part of a community. And I think that's the biggest challenge in online teaching, but it's also where some of the greatest rewards can come in, that you have to foster that sense of presence and community and get rid of that anonymous feeling with it.
Well, that's all really sage and marvelous advice. So let's wrap up with, what are 3 top takeaways you would say about the teaching of writing?
3 top takeaways. I would say, and I would frame this as something that would apply specifically to online, but
good.
Of course you could do this with on ground as well. First one is flexibility. And again, I think that's a lesson we all learned recently with the pandemic. But flexibility, students oftentimes are holding down multiple jobs, have different social roles, family, etc. And so learning to be able to work with students and with their own schedules helps. I think also just flexibility with yourself. If you see something not working inside the classroom, it's okay to scrap it in the middle of and
so
start
true.
over.
Yep.
Well, not start over.
Yes.
Maybe not start over.
Yeah,
but
we get it.
Yeah, it does. The second one would be empathy. I think we have to teach with empathy, and that might be a whole other podcast and conversation at some point in the future. What does that mean to teach with empathy? It is so important in this society to be able to foster a sense of compassion, I think, for students. And then the third one would be what I mentioned a moment ago about translation, learning that not all concepts work or not all approaches work in all settings, and knowing how to translate effectively from one setting to the next.
Well, those 3 words need to be imprinted in any teacher's brain, whether you're online or on ground. And I want to thank you so much for this marvelous conversation today. And I know that Sofie's been highly engaged. She has her phone here. But in any event, thank you so much, Paula, for
Thank you, Gil.
Wonderful chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me on to the Writing with Sofie podcast. And I am so excited for you with your recent publications of the textbooks, which I would recommend for all students and educators. And so thank you so much for having me on here.
Thanks a lot, and have a good rest of the day.
You too.
That's a wrap.